I have the pleasure of speaking with Dustin Patterson, National Manager of Supply Chain Services with Logiquip today, and we're going to talk about how Logiquip helps healthcare supply chains do more with less and ensure that you always have the needed supplies on hand. So, Dustin, I want to welcome you to the Power Supply Podcast. Really been looking forward to this conversation. I think I saw you at one of the supply chain conferences almost coming up on a year ago now. And we talked quite a bit at that event. And so I have been looking forward to this. Welcome to the show.
Appreciate it. Happy to be here. Yeah, I think it was in September, so long time coming, but I'm excited.
Let's talk a little bit about your background. I know we're going to, talk a lot about what you've done with Logiquip over the years and really that, customer focused approach that you all are taking to drive some efficiencies, in the healthcare supply chain. But what's your background? Because I think even your career arc at Logiquip is really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. My background, I came to Logiquip from Walmart back in 2007, which is 18 years. Is crazy to think about. Um, yeah, so I started in shipping and receiving, sales fulfillment. It's funny, on my first day here, I came from Walmart, um, very advanced organization. This was back in 2007. My first day here at Logiquip, um, on the shipping and receiving floor, like, okay, here's where we make the bill of ladings, and here's the typewriter that you use. And I'm like, typewriter? I step into an antique store. Um, but no, it's cool just to see, like, as the years have progressed, how Logiquip's progressed. And then my progression here, um, I was in sales fulfillment, so shipping and receiving on the floor. I knew how to do space planning, which is pretty critical to what we do. So computer aided drafting. So that was my entree into the service side of the business. And so getting to know our customers and the spaces that we're in. And I've probably looked at 1,000 clean supply rooms on paper, laying them out spatially and trying to make that work. And then went into customer service as a customer service representative and elevated to manager of that department. And I've always loved connecting with people and helping them solve problems. And so that was a good fit. Um, Moved to operations manager after that. That was cool. Started to understand at a higher level just the logistics of what it takes to get our product to our customers. And then recently made a transition over to the dark side of the business, sales. Um, and it's not. I mean, it's not any different. I mean, I'm still building relationships and helping people solve problems. It's just external to the organization. So it's been a fun ride. People always ask me, like, you know, what do you do? And I explained to them, like, we help customers make sure that they have the products they need when a patient needs them. But yeah, it's been a fun ride.
I always love to hear stories about how people rise through the ranks, but I also know that some of the most successful salespeople are people that have done the job
Yeah.
and really know the product very well. And so I just think that is a testament to how well educated and knowledgeable you are about solving those real problems when you're working with customers. I just think that's so very important.
Yeah.
Um, and so I bet you're having a lot of fun. You're probably traveling a lot more, but you must be having some fun.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned, knowing our product really well. That was a huge benefit to me going into sales. Um, but getting out in healthcare, as you know, like, it is such a unique context. Um, and so I remember one of my first sales calls out in the field. I was in Iowa, central Iowa, and I was in the clean supply room, and I was helping a customer and a sales rep troubleshoot, how they were going to fit all this supplies in a room. And I said to the supply chain manager, I said, well, I don't know, this is one of my first experiences out in a hospital. I don't know your supplies, but I do know our product and how to make, product fit in them. And I was like, I don't even know what these supplies are. And I'm pointing to a shelf, and all that was on the shelf was a bunch of, double A, triple A batteries. And the guy's like, dude, those are batteries. I'm like, okay, all right, well, I know what those are, but it comes quick. You get to you adapt and you learn and you study but yeah, I was pretty green when I first came out of the Logiquip world into the healthcare world.
Yeah. Well, and you also have a lot of experiences with, I think it's now 4S and lean, but I think at the time it was 3S, right? That was that's a good story too.
Yeah, yeah. So, just for the audience benefit, I was doing a lunch and learn in Dallas with two of my coworkers, and we were doing a lunch and learn to some equipment planners, and I was telling them about how Logiquip's products support the 5S's, and they do 6S now. But for the life of me, I got through three of them, and we've all had this like the public speaking moment where you just go completely blank. So I got through three of them, and I'm like, and there's two more, and I remember the guy sitting in the front row like audibly laugh at me, and so the two coworkers that were there, and now everyone in the organization, even though this was probably, I don't know, 7 years ago, still quote the three S's to me. So
That's great. It's kind of funny though. I remember educating in front of large groups, and I know that little pause moment where you know the answer, but it's just everything stops for a second in your mind. And I honestly, they probably paid more attention after that because you weren't doing death by PowerPoint. You were kind of
yeah,
like a real human in that moment. So
yeah,
that's great.
yeah. At least it was
Um,
memorable.
at least it's definitely memorable for your coworkers.
I love it.
um, yeah. I want to talk a little bit about Logiquip. You talk about your coworkers, and the great team that you have there. And I know you're very customer centric. And I think it says a lot how customer centric you are just by you now taking this experience, that you have just about in every facet of the business and then using that to be an expert to support the customers. But can you talk a little bit, like set the table on Logiquip before we kind of move into the conversation a little bit more granular today?
Yeah. Our philosophy as an organization is to be customer centric, and I think if you pulled all the organizations, they would all say that. But um, I see it every day in every facet of the organization, from sales fulfillment to customer support to our sales reps to our installation team, our supply chain services team. Um, we're truly focused on the customer's outcome, even if that means we have to maybe repurpose some of the existing hardware they have in a different arrangement that suits them. In that scenario, we don't quote unquote get revenue. So if you're looking at it from a business sense, you think, okay, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it does, because where we view our value as being an advisor to the customer, someone that's alongside of them for a journey. We're not transactional. This isn't, hey, we want to sell you a shelf and move on. We want to make sure that we're selling you, or that we're providing to you the solution that you need, that's going to be what you need and how you need it to be. um, we're not prescriptive in what we offer. We try to be contextualized to the customer and say, okay, help me understand your distribution model, help me understand your goals, let me talk to some of the stakeholders. In our space, I feel like Logiquip's unique because we can make situations a win-win for both clinical staff, care provider or providers of care, as well as operational staff, supply chain staff. And so trying to discern from both parties what their outcome is, what their goals are, um, and then work towards that. I think allows us to be a customer centric organization, to the point where we get a commitment from them, and then from there we try to make sure that we're executing, communicating well, that they feel supported throughout that entire process.
And I know also something that you mentioned to me was just, really being willing to earn opportunities. Nothing is too small. And then often you find that winds up growing the relationship. I think you had a story about a flood
Yeah.
that happened in sterile processing one time.
Yeah, yeah. This was back. I was on the operational side of the business, so we were more supporting the sales rep and the sales manager in this way. But we had an account in Ohio that had a flood in their SPD, and they were in a bad situation where they needed casters. So the rep or the regional sales manager, I can't recall which one, drove up the next day, picked up the casters from our distribution center here in Southwest Michigan, drove it back down, and within 24 hours had them back to the point where they had, usable racks and were able to. An SPD flood is a terrible situation. In the last, I mean, of all the equipment in there, but you got to also store your supplies, and so making sure that we responded quickly, and that's one of, I mean, many stories. Our sales reps and our internal team are 100% committed to any project that the customer needs, any issue the customer has from a storage challenge. It's not too big or too small for us. We want to make sure that we're that trusted advisor through that whole process.
Yeah, I think the consultative nature, and like you talked about, where you'd worked with drawings long before you ever really walked in and saw storage spaces, and there's many of them within healthcare organizations. And we're going to talk today about the various solutions that you have, like your inventory management system and Teleflip. But I think even before that, like now that you're out in the field and you're talking to people that are working on the front lines instead of kind of supporting from the internal ops standpoint, like and I think everybody out there kind of knows, but what are the things that I think supply healthcare in general, but the clinicians and the supply chain teams that you're supporting, what's kind of the new stressors for them or increased stressors for them that you feel like, we've really been able to help them in these scenarios? Because we just kind of know, like, there's lots of expansion going on. There's not always increased square footage to do those expansions. There's communication in terms of like supply demand from clinicians to supply chain, and the financial stress and the need for efficiency to really be able to support increased case volume, I think has put healthcare under quite a bit of duress. Never mind back orders and all the other things that have been adding up lately. Like, what are you finding are kind of the major pain points that you're able to help with?
Yeah, I think to sum it up with one sentence, it would be in every facet of the healthcare organizations, they're being asked to do more with less. The clinicians are being asked to do more with less from a staffing perspective. Supply chain staffing for sure. Small supply rooms are getting smaller and smaller. And fewer and further between. They're non-revenue generating, right? So they want to create space for beds and procedural rooms, and I get all that, but oftentimes neglect the concept of what it takes to support those revenue generating rooms, and those people that are doing quote unquote revenue generating activities or patient care. Um, it's yeah, it's remarkable to me just how consistently across the board healthcare systems are asked to do more with less. Um, then you throw on top of that, global supply chain issues, global distress. It creates an environment where they want to store more supplies. They want to have more space to store more supplies, and physically can't make the building larger. Although I do think, Justin, if we came up with a building stretcher, we would probably have a multi-million dollar idea. But no, all jokes aside, there's not enough space to store the supplies that are needed. Healthcare is also constantly evolving. So on the provider side of it is so innovative. It's in new products and new procedures are getting introduced all the time, and so then, but they're not doing some of the older procedures either, so you have to maintain even more items in the supply room or more items in the operating room area. And so coming in with creative ways to do that is a challenge. So that would, I think those are what I would say they're the biggest challenges.
Yeah, I think, having clinicians focusing more on patient care is, as you just talked about, is really important. And I can't remember if I shared this with you or not, but, I worked as a registered nurse for many, many years before, moving to the dark side, as you kind of said at the beginning, and taking a role in sales, and then, ultimately, building, the podcast and the podcast businesses. But, at the end of the day, I remember just doing a lot of non-patient care type activities, when I was a nurse. And, definitely when I was a CNA, like I worked, as a CNA while I went to nursing school. But But even as a nurse, in a lot of cases, I did spend a decent amount of time. And we're not even talking about surgical services, right? And once you start getting into surgery, in sterile storage environments and, having the core versus, where materials and SPD lie. And, there's just a lot of management of that inventory that comes up. And there's nothing worse than going to the storeroom and not finding what you need, and then all of a sudden you're on the hunt for the supply instead of staying in front of the patient, as much as possible. And I think, it's great that, what you're doing, to help optimize that clinical care time. It's really, really important. And I think also you're probably enabling supply chain to be the expert that they need to be in managing the supply. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about, like, how do you make the clinicians' lives easier? Like, I kind of gave an example, but what are they doing on a day-to-day basis that, is kind of mundane and not really top of license that you're able to help with and kind of reduce the amount of time they're spending on non-clinical activities?
Yeah, that's a great question and thought process. And uh, this hit me in a real way. I was in the grocery store. Sure, I'll say shortly into my time being out in sales, and I walked to the rack, and the grocery item that I wanted wasn't on the rack, and I started throwing a pity party to myself, starting to think about, okay, where am I? Like, how far is the next store? Like, what's that going to take? My kids are waiting at home for dinner, like all this stuff. And then it hit me almost in that moment, like, well, okay, so because this is always top of mind for me. Um, Imagine being a nurse walking into a storeroom and you have a critical patient who needs a critical supply and it's not on the rack. Like, this is this is um, such a minor issue compared to that. And so yeah, I'm pretty passionate about making sure when nursing goes to a supply room that the supply is there and that they can find it. Frankly, sometimes the supplies are there. It's just the rooms can be somewhat in disarray, or disorganized to the point where they can't find the supply. And so, a huge component to what we offer, that helps the clinicians in this space is to organize the room. So, we have tools and algorithms that help us take inventory lists and index them in a way that makes sense for the clinicians. So, if you would have certain types of syringes, we would put those all in the same vicinity. All the items that you would want on to start an IV, you would have all those items together. We would also color code those items. So oftentimes when you walk into a supply room, you're looking at 400 items across maybe 16 feet of wall. It becomes a sea of supplies, right? And so color coding that allows for to drill that room down into a smaller size. So instead of looking at 16 feet of wall space, now you're looking at maybe 3 feet of red label tags. And so now you're like, okay, well, here's my IV supplies. And so that helps draw their attention there. And then we'll label the supplies in a way that makes sense to them. There's a supply out there, everyone refers to it as a Christmas tree. It's not actually a Christmas tree, much to my surprise and disappointment. There was no Christmas trees in the supply room. However, they call these the Christmas trees, and so we label it a Christmas tree. Like, if everyone calls it a Christmas tree, why are we using an ERP short description on the label tag that nobody can read? Now, supply chain needs that. We'll put that on the back of the label so that they have that to reference when they need to reorder. But we want to make sure that when clinicians walk in the room, that they have a good experience. And that might sound crazy to say, but that's something that we're passionate about here.
Yeah. Well, I think we got to walk through some of your solutions here and, make sure we're not going to start with IntelliFlip, but I definitely want to talk about the origin story,
Yeah,
of
yeah.
IntelliFlip. But let's start with your foundation, par wire and par wall lines. Like, talk a little bit more about that. I think you're kind of already describing what it might look like when you walk into a storeroom, but let's take each one of these and kind of walk through exactly what their purpose is and how they support the supply chain. So,
Yeah, of course. So for me, the basis and the framework and everything that we build off the foundation is our par wall and par wire baskets. Those are fine mesh baskets. The benefits to those is there's no solid surface at the bottom. Now we will put a solid inlay at the bottom so that we're compliant. But as far as the shelves go, above the top shelf, it's all fine mesh, so that there's no need to clean out plastic bins. I was just in an account on Wednesday. helping them with some storage conversions and looking in their plastic bins. And there's dust and there's all sorts of things that get collected in there. I'm not going to get into it here, but that all that filters down to the bottom, and then there's an inlay that gets wiped off there. But the big benefit is it's open front, so you're able to see the supply really well. It helps supports the clinicians being able to find the supplies. The baskets pull out, which helps nurses and supply chain staff get those supplies that are on the bottom shelves. We've all had to go to a storeroom, and you would have experienced this in your CNA and your NA day. Like, you walk into a supply room, you got to get the supply in the bottom shelf, in the back of that shelf. You're on your hands and knees and you're reaching for it. So we want to alleviate that with our pull-out baskets. But I think the biggest benefit to it is how much space that it allows to store supplies. And so we're able to fit the par for each supply and the size of it as efficiently as possible. So oftentimes you're taking supplies and you're trying to fit it into a bin, and it doesn't really fit very well. Where with our basket system, we're putting dividers in to meet that exact footprint of that supply and maximizing that space horizontally, and then as much as we can vertically by getting as many baskets vertically as we can. So that to me is the foundation of the storage solutions that we offer.
Well, storerooms are not attached to revenue, and so oftentimes they're not getting, you
Yep.
know, the square footage and space that you might otherwise like to have. And so now I want to talk about the fully automated solution.
Mhm.
This is kind of a combination of the flipper system and automation. And so,
Yeah.
let's talk about how did this even come about, and let's talk about how the automation can really help transform the supply chain.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So, well, we've always had our baskets. Soon after we brought our baskets to market, lots of people started talking through the concept of Kanban and hospital and how to trigger orders, how to make processes more efficient. And coming from automotive industry, which is huge, I'm in Michigan, and that's so tons of that around here. What we were experiencing is people were taking out our high capacity baskets for a two bin Kanban system in the sakes of streamlining the order processing. And so we couldn't have that. We understood that spaces was of the premium and getting the supplies in there, so there had to be a way. And so we created our patented Kanban flipper. And it was just it was a way to create a Kanban system that was integrated into our basket. So as the nurse uh, takes the supplies, they come up across a plastic divider. And I would encourage everyone to go to our website. You'll see this on the main page. Um, the next nurse that comes in, they can't access the supply behind that plastic acrylic Kanban flipper until pulling it down, and then they can access the safety stock in the back there. Um, the great thing to that is, okay, so then when the supply techs go in the room, all they're doing is scanning or counting the items that have flippers in the down position. The great thing for nursing is they know that if that flipper is in the down position, that supply is going to get ordered, giving them peace of mind that there. But almost the second that we came out with that, and that might be hyperbolic, but very shortly after we came up with the Kanban flipper, people were saying, okay, that's great, but how do we automate it? Like, I don't even want to send someone up the room to have to scan this. And so um, our CEO and owner of the company, one of the smartest guys I know, you know, we were talking through, like, dialoguing. Okay, here's what the customers want. Here's what we have, and he's thinking. He's like, I think we could do it. And he rattled off like three different options of how we could do it. And so he went to work and came back with our IntelliFlip system as we know it today. And the way that operates is there's a beacon essentially that's on that flipper, and it's monitoring position. So once the nurse pulls that flipper into the down position, that beacon starts to signal that it's in the down position. So at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, any facility that's an IntelliFlip customer, any of the flippers that are in down position will be reordered with no need for supply chain to go up to the room, and no additional steps for nursing other than pulling the supplies as they would typically intend to.
Yeah, there's almost like a real time demand input that's happening, right? And so it's not just that you don't have to go up to the room and scan it, it's also that, you kind of remove some of the manual error that could happen. in ordering, and you're ensuring that the demand signal is coming through and shortening the time for reordering too, right? Like if the schedule on some of these more remote storerooms, I'm thinking even when you get out of the confines of, like the walls of an acute hospital, and you start getting into clinics and things like that, like, yeah, you're the schedule for supply chain to potentially be looking at those bins, might be Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, or one day a week. And so, by getting that demand signal without somebody physically having to be present, or relying on, hey, what happens if somebody calls out? Like if the clinicians are the ones that are, submitting, or, the orders, in some cases, depending on the setting, that's the case, and they don't do it, or they, it's their job and they're out for 2 weeks. All of a sudden there could be, a delay in ordering, and that can have downstream impacts. And so, I think that's the automation is so key.
You you hit a ton of things right there, and we could probably set up a podcast and talk through the three things that you just outlined there. But if I could elaborate just real quickly on a couple of things.
Yeah,
So, um,
absolutely.
you're right. So the offsite area is a huge area of opportunity for supply chain to get more efficient. If they're sending somebody there to go count, that's wildly inefficient. Especially in these, well, either rural or dense cities. Either way, it's the same issue. It's taking you hours. It's just the distance that you're covering in that hour. Um, is remarkably different. But so there's that. But then also, or you could have clinicians that are doing it, which again, you're taking away from patient care. Maybe as an administrator, um, they're not maybe accustomed to it, or wasn't. There's could be ways to do it better. Um, but I'll say this, something that this is also huge. So there's, stockouts are an issue all the time. Think about an ED. If you're in an ED, and you're stocking out of supply, and you come in Monday morning, and the nurse manager is frustrated, rightfully so. Hey, we ran out of the supply over the weekend. We had to figure it out. What IntelliFlip allows you to do is to understand what type of problem that is. And what I mean by that is, okay, so if you run out of a supply, Justin, at 5 o'clock on a Friday versus 5 o'clock on Sunday in the evening, those are two different problems to solve, right? Like, one of them you're wildly off. One of them it's probably a minor adjustment, right? Like you almost were there, and maybe so what IntelliFlip does then is gives you the visibility to say, okay, what kind of problem am I trying to solve, right? What is the actual problem that I'm trying to fix here? Not just, well, we're stocked out. Okay, well, when did you stock out? Um, how quickly was that demand or that supply used relative to how often it is typically used? Because you're going to have situations where we're working off the law of averages. Sometimes you're going to have instances where you have a patient that requires more than that supply than what you would typically ever use. And then Teleflip has ways to help alleviate some trouble when that particular instance happens. But um, it gives you the ability to have some greater visibility into what the problems that we're trying to solve.
Yet that real time demand gives you a better idea. That point you just made about Friday and Sunday gives you a much better idea on consumption. And, that's probably going to give you a lot of data to do some analytics about, to your point, what's the real corrective action here? Knowing when it actually stocked out versus when you discovered that it stocked out are two totally different conversations. And so, yeah, that automation is so key. And a lot of, like, what you're talking about ultimately is there are a lot of compromises that we make, to deliver patient care. Sometimes we're compromising on patient care because, like what you said, we ran out, and we ran out on maybe Saturday morning or whatever. And maybe it's related to a large trauma incident, and they're all coming into the ED. And you have to get creative. You can't just be like, oh, we'll do this on Monday, we'll push it back a little bit. It's not an elective
Right,
procedure. And
right.
so you're compromising on patient care when you've got to kind of find a different way to accomplish the task. And the same thing with even just space for supply chain. Like, the number of supplies that you can store with the space that you have requires you to start making some compromises. And so I feel like what you're talking about is just compromising less, or removing compromise from the equation, all together and getting to an optimal kind of level. I want to talk a little bit about, like ease of implementation. There's some things, we're touching on it when we talk about the analytics and the reordering, but we haven't really specified like there's an ERP integration. So, let's start with ease of implementation. Obviously, if you've got a solution that's sending demand signals electronically and it's integrating with the ERP, then you've got to get IT involved. And if there's anything I know about IT sourcing in healthcare today, it's that, it's gotten much more robust. In some cases, it moves slower. And so, how do you guys kind of navigate that so that, once you identify, that a customer has a need and they want to move forward, but they want to take full advantage of the automation and the ERP integration, how do you move through that quickly?
That's a great question. Um, so on the technology side of it, the IntelliFlip system um, is not holding any patient information. So we're transacting the par, what the inventory level is, what the reorder point is, what the item is, and what the manufacturer is. And so the file transfer protocol that we use is very structured, very simple, very streamlined, and so we're able to typically streamline that process with healthcare IT by providing them our security documentation, providing them our transfer protocols, and being responsive. We talk about being customer centric and customer focused. That includes IT in our mind, and so we have people here that talk that language with them. That's not me, clearly, and just walking that through that whole process, it's very straightforward. And then I'll say like even on the ease of implementation on the racking side of it, so we can also take that project part of the project over and implement that. So if you talk about converting storerooms, if you have 50 clean supply rooms in a hospital and you're already stretched thin, the thought process of biting off one of those projects, or even like if you're in sterile processing, you're thinking about redoing your instrumentation storage, but you're already taxed. Like the last thing you want to do is take on another weekend project. And so Logiquip has the team of people who know healthcare supply chain, know how to set up supply rooms, can have conversations with the clinical staff, with the supply chain staff, get buy-in on how the room will look from a cart templating standpoint, build the racks, bring them in, stock the racks, label the racks, um, install the flippers and the technology. And I'll say, on average, we're converting a room in a day. And so when we're on site, right? So from the time that we start in the morning to the time that we leave in the afternoon, that room is done because we do not want to impact patient care. Oftentimes these are live departments, and so speed is the operative, and we want to make sure that we're not impacting patient care any more than we have to.
So when we talk about the ERP integration, how much does that automate reordering? I mean, we know, there's a lot of people that are doing, I'd say, more mundane tasks in the healthcare supply chain that have the ability to sort of grow within the organization the same way you have at Logiquip, just by being able to focus on more strategic initiatives as you remove some of that mundane and redundant manual effort. Does that ERP integration, really help, take that out of the equation and allow supply chain leaders to maximize the team members that they have on their team?
Yeah. I mean, it that integration piece of it allows for that reorder process to be streamlined straight from the IntelliFlip system, into the purchase system, and so it takes any of that manual intervention out of it, and allows it frees up this healthcare supply chain management team's time to do the things that they're asked to do that they don't have time to do. Cycle counts. Oftentimes people use it as a bridge to start to manage other areas, respiratory therapy. The procedural spaces where as they do get involved, they can deliver a lot of value in how they manage those supplies. Um, you know, do you want those people helping source critical OR supplies, or do you want them counting how many 4x4s are in 3 West? You know, that's where we're trying to help the health systems get to.
What about like with back orders? Then all of a sudden you've got to deal with substitutes, but then you have this integration with the ERP. How do you handle those
That's a
scenarios?
great question. So, the IntelliFlip system, I would say, handles substitutions very well. So, if you're substituting, a box of gloves from one vendor to another, um, when you make that update in your ERP, and that you move from item A to item B, the next time that flipper goes down, it's going to order item B and continue to order item B until um, you switch back to item A if it's not a permanent switch, if it's just a temporary switch. That allows you to the opportunity to make those switches without having to get to all the rooms to physically change all the labels if you're in a scanning environment. And then at the racks itself, and this might sound trivial, but if you're making substitutions, sometimes the packaging change, sometimes the unit of measure in the package is different, and it might require more space on the rack. And that's where our power wire racks really help, by being able to, um, you know, uh, move those dividers around to fit that inventory level versus having a plastic bin situation where you got to get a different bin in, and then if it doesn't fit on the shelf, then you're trying to figure out what other shelf to put it on, and it creates a daisy chain. Then the next time the nurse walks in the room, the supply isn't where it was, and it's back ordered, but it's not back ordered. Um, now I'm ranting now, but the system allows for those physical changes at the rack even to be more simple. And so, it's not just on the technology side of it, although that is a huge component. It's also the physical space to which the substitution takes up that the system, I think, is very accommodating to.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, being able to do those kinds of system wide
Mm-hmm.
substitutes that easily, I think is definitely important,
Yeah.
because it is the number of back orders is like exponentially increased.
Yeah.
All right, so before I read a testimonial for you to respond to, and talk about how they can work with you all to kind of transform their supply chain, one of the buzzwords that we've heard in this industry a lot, especially over the last 5 years. I mean, it's always been around, but I feel like increased focus on resiliency and sustainability. So, what kind of redundancies are built into the system?
Oh, that's a great question. So we work with health systems. They have IntelliFlip implemented. You know, I hope this never happens to systems, but sometimes an IT event will happen, and that's why we talk about the security protocols earlier are so critical to make sure that systems are protected. But sometimes things happen, and healthcare systems lose access to their systems. Sometimes they have outages where IntelliFlip is integrated into ERPs. However, it is also has its own standalone interface, web portal. So if, let's say, a health system where we're not able to access their ERP for whatever reason, IntelliFlip can provide them a daily report of the items that need to be reordered for their health system. So they will not lose. They would still have uptime procedure as it pertains to um, IntelliFlip. IntelliFlip also has a cellular component to it. So if you're in a healthcare room, supply room, and let's say that the Wi-Fi were to go out, the internet were to go out, it will cut over to cell service, allowing for uptime procedures to maintain. And then if something were to ever happen to all those, and so let's say there was a massive event, you still have the down flipper, right? So you still have a physical representation in the room of the supplies that need to be reordered, um, without having to count every single item or go back to a completely manual process. You would have to go to each room, but you would have that flipper in the down position to be able to reorder those supplies.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you have several levels of redundancy, and even worst case scenario,
Yep.
you just go back to what you always did before, and you have a physical indicator on what needs to happen. And I think between self service
Yep.
and hospital Wi-Fi, you ought to be pretty covered. That's a pretty rare event, that you'd have to send staff, but
Yeah.
but
Yep.
um, but honestly, being able to do that quickly, that just is really important. So, all right, I'm going to read one of your local customers' comments. It's a regional manager of supply chain site operations, there in Michigan. And he said the Logiquip IntelliFlip system is extremely simple and we feel will be a big benefit to our team as well as nursing. Feedback and benefits of this system were very positive from nursing and supply chain staff. My director is looking to push the system out to all the sites in the near future. So, I imagine some time has passed, since that quote, came through, and maybe you are system wide now, but it says a lot about what you're really touting is marrying two sometimes competing needs and perspectives, which is clinicians and supply chain, and really serving both of those stakeholders, and in a way that they both are have equal importance and success with the implementation.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Um, I love that quote. That's one of my, I really appreciate that customer because that customer took the right approach to it. They, that was actually a new hospital that they were opening. They were merging two hospitals into one. They were picking up a tremendous amount of work. When I say they, supply chain were, um, they're going to start managing nurse servers. I think lab and endo were areas that they were picking up. So it was an area where they used technology to help, supplement some of that additional work that they were going to be getting. Um, but yeah, it's always cool to hear your customers give you feedback, and something that we're pretty passionate about here is proving the concept. And so if anybody is interested in this particular customer, same thing. Um, we'll come in and we'll set up a room, and we'll because it's one thing for me to get on a podcast and say, okay, this thing is the best thing since sliced bread. It's another thing for me to get it in a supply room and show people the difference that it makes. And I happens every single time. Nurses will come in and say, this is amazing, this is so great, I can't believe that, the transformation in this room, we need this up on, X and X unit. um, and it really touts the benefit. And then for the supply chain side of it, so you start to get buy-in from the clinicians, and on supply chain side of it, we can start to contextualize the return on investment. So we can, do some pre-time studies, post-time studies. We can look at some analytics around the room and the ordering pre and post, and then we can have some real justification numbers to take to senior leadership to say, hey, this system is worth the investment. Because if we can't justify it, then there's no point. But this allows them to have the opportunity to take that to the next step.
I love your approach to, kind of earning the
Yep.
business. This is why you're customer centric. You're talking about actually doing the studies to create the data that justifies the expense. Because, budget doesn't just open up magically
Yep.
or
Nope.
theoretically. And so to give somebody, tangible data, tangible results, that's so important. And it says that you're willing to put in the work to earn the business. So free demo, proof of concept, and then some assistance, with ROI and really building a case for making a transformation in your organization. That's huge. They're going to be at ARM, that annual conference and expo. It's coming up very soon. It's going to be in Denver. If you're going, make sure to visit them. You can also call to learn more. Their general line is 800-665-3760. You can also email Dustin. This one's easy, Dustin at logiquip.net. I'll spell Logiquip. It's Logiquip. Again, Dustin at logiquip.net. You can also visit their website or request a demo by going to logiquip.com/power supply. And here's the fun thing. And Dustin, we'll wrap on this. I'll let you add some final thoughts. But I also think you like to be not only customer centric, but you like to have a little bit of fun. And there's actually a video game that folks can play to help them kind of prove the time savings. And you can just go to intellifliphero.com. So again, Intelliflip, it's INTELLIFLIP. And then you're just going to add hero.com to the end of that. Intellifliphero.com. It's a fun way to prove the time savings that can be achieved here. Dustin, you did a great job with this interview, and I loved hearing your story with the organization. And you obviously take a great deal of pride in the work that you do, and you want to do it well. I heard that loud and clear, and I think your background in supply chain and kind of understanding the concepts makes you just a tremendous resource. So I want to thank you again, and see if you have any final thoughts before we wrap up.
uh, I greatly appreciate the opportunity. Now, I love Logiquip. I love healthcare supply chain. I love what I do. Um, and it's an honor to be able to talk to you and to the folks listening to this. Thank you for your time. Greatly appreciate it. And if there is a problem that you're having supply chain related, give us a call. If we can't answer it, we probably know somebody who can. And we truly just want to help. So I'm grateful for the opportunity, Justin. Thank you so much.